Hi, my name is Red Vern, and the name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. And this show is composed entirely of my own opinions, not the opinions of my agency or any other agency of the federal government. I didn't get any approval from the public affairs officer or anybody in my agency or in the federal government. I've decided to unilaterally strike out and express my own opinions. And on this particular day, I have a lot of opinions to express, and none of them are very, very pretty. Today, as I said, I'm proud to be a federal worker. Federal workers are excoriated by politicians and excoriated by various characters in our society, people who don't contribute anything. But in a few days, we may find out, much to our regret, how much federal workers do provide our people. And I'm proud to be a federal worker. I'm proud to serve the people of our country, just like all the other civil servants out there. But on this particular day, I'm neither proud of the Congress, which we have elected, nor am I particularly proud of the president, which we have elected. One of my little mantras is that the federal worker just carries out the policies and laws and statutes that the Congress passed, the Congress that you've elected has passed, and the president that you've elected has signed. Today, I'm very chagrined and I'm really sad that we're in the fix that we're in, and that we have the Congress that we have, and that we have the president that we have. Because today, usually I try to make my speech as general as possible and not to try to fix it in time in case it gets rerun. But today is November 13th, and today is the day that the continuing resolution will probably be vetoed. And if it does, 800,000 of us federal workers are going to be go to work tomorrow and be sent home without pay. There's been a few of these kind of situations before, and none have lasted more than a half a day during a work day. There was one 3-day weekend when weekend workers were sent away by Mr. Regan, but the situation was resolved by the end of that weekend. And the pay was restored, I must admit. But this is a special case. This is a situation where people have decided to do nothing more and have absolutely no more legitimacy than to play politics with the federal government, full faith and credit of the federal government, the full faith and credit of America. And to me, I believe that the federal workers that are being sent away are better patriots than the Congress of the United States that's created this situation, and the President of the United States that's allowed this situation to fester. The Congress really shouldn't take extraneous situations and extraneous issues and tack them on to a continuing resolution. What is a continuing resolution, for those of you who don't know? The budget was not passed at the first day of the fiscal year. The Constitution and everything that the federal government has built up as far as precedent's concerned says that on October 1st of every single year, the Congress has to have a budget passed. And this year, the Congress did not do its duty, proved itself to be inefficient and incompetent, if I can use words that are very, very strong, and failed to pass a budget. And this is the Republican Congress that was elected to do a more professional job and do a better job than its Democratic forebears. And even though there have been situations where they haven't passed a budget, the Republican Congress, who has absolutely nobody to fight with but themselves and who can pass it by themselves, and both houses failed to pass a budget bill. They did pass a continuing resolution that lasted for 5 or 6 weeks. That continuing resolution ends today, which means that at 12 o'clock, 12 midnight, 12:01, there will be no money as far as spending is concerned. Does that mean that they can't spend? Well, they are going to continue to spend. The Army is still going to stay out. The FBI is still going to investigate crime. The Amtrak trains are going to run. The Social Security checks are going to go out. Everything, the mail is going to get delivered. Everything that people really need the government for in its day-to-day business is going to remain open, which is kind of too bad because the real importance of what they're doing is, and the real silliness and the real hurt that they're creating is going to be hidden, and that's really too bad. I feel that maybe they should just say the planes won't fly tomorrow, and Congress will get their act together, and they'll pass a clean continuing resolution the next minute. Now, what has happened? What have they done over here? Well, Congress decided, because the Republicans can't seem to get their act together in the House Senate conferees. There's 13 spending bills that have to be put before the president to have a completed budget. There's only 5 been put before the president, only 2 have been signed. One of them may well be vetoed. And there are 8 that are sitting there in House Senate conferees, and Republican versus Republican can't get their act together and are just completely incompetent and can't do what they need to do. Now, in any normal circumstance, they would just continue, pass a continuing resolution, says we will continue to spend money in the same manner as before, no changes, no new policies, nothing different, and we will continue to go from here and allow the government to continue to run while we do our job that we are late and incompetent in doing. But no, they had to throw all kinds of really bizarre and extremely unpopular issues in there, putting the president against the wall and saying, well, raise the Medicare premiums. Oh, we're not raising it, we're just keeping it the way it is. But in fact, there is a raise going on. It's going from $46 a month to $53 a month. And if the law had continued the way it was, because they jacked up those Medicare premiums a few years ago, it should have gone down to $42 a month. It's $11 a month, $121 a year. That's going to be absorbed by the elderly. It's a tax increase by anybody's view, by the strict definition of a tax, which is paying more for the same benefits that the law allows you to have. And that's what they want the president to sign on to, and he's going to veto it. That's just part of it. There are a whole bunch of these little bitty issues. They want to set a spending program. There's a whole bunch of little things like the ISTIC amendment that they've thrown in there. And I discussed the ISTIC amendment yesterday, and it's almost too irritating to repeat. But basically, it shuts down nonprofit foundations from spending their own money to do public advocacy. And there's a very vague definition of public advocacy in that. If they receive a certain amount of federal grants of one kind or another. Now, I guess the conservatives say, well, we never get grants, but some of these wildly liberal charities that they're trying to get at include the YMCA and the United Way, the Heart Fund, and some other left-wing radical organizations that are obviously too dangerous to be allowed to testify before Congress or send out mailers. One of the worst parts about it, it says that companies are not allowed to or have to control any spending that they have with organizations that they're not allowed to receive federal grants that hire or buy anything from another organization that spends more than 15% of its money on political advocacy. And IBM, GM, all kinds of large companies have said that would just put an unreasonable bureaucratic burden on us and is a silly law. But that doesn't seem to have stopped them, and that added bureaucracy doesn't seem to slow down people who have their little enemies and are going to do what they're going to do. Now, so far, the only actual action that I know about is the debt ceiling bill has been vetoed. And the debt ceiling bill is a routine matter. When the government comes to its limit on how much it's allowed to spend or how much it's allowed to borrow, Congress has to actually take an action and pass an increase in the debt ceiling. There have been debt ceiling issues that have come up before. There have been issues about it. But in this particular one, they said that they could raise the debt ceiling from 4.9 trillion to 4.967, which is an addition of $67 billion in borrowing power until December 12th. But then in December 12th, it goes down to $4.8 trillion, which is probably less than the government has. So it forces an immediate default with what they sent to the president. And on top of that, right now there's a number of different things the president can do without being able to go out and borrow more to actually decrease the net amount of spending, even though it costs more in the long run. It still avoids a default, which would be a disaster to the bond markets and to the markets throughout the world, and would put the full faith and credit of the United States at stake. This particular bill that was sent to Clinton disallows any transfer of monies from the various funds and trust funds and federal disability funds and so on and so forth that would cover that particular deficit and allow the government to continue to meet its obligations for the foreseeable future. Needless to say, that's a situation that was an easy veto. Only a sucker would have signed that bill. But Clinton still could have done something about it. He could have gone back there and he could have talked to them. They've allowed the situation to fester and to come to this point, to act like a bunch of babies and a bunch of kids, is really amazing to me and astounding to me, especially from people who insult federal workers and call us bureaucrats and lazy and who knows what else. Here's an organization that comes up and the leader of which, Gingrich, gets on television and says, the president virtually hung up on me. He wouldn't talk to me about what I wanted to talk about. The president came in there and said, well, we'll allow Congress to come, the congressional leaders to come in, but Democrats have to be with the Republicans. And the Republicans said, how could they do that? How could they ask Democrats to come with us as well as Republicans? So they just played the whole thing like a bunch of babies. And it was almost comical if I wasn't going to be going to work tomorrow and finding out that I'm going to be sent home without a paycheck. Anybody else watching this farce on television and this bunch of silly babies cackling along and saying, you first, no, you first, no, you first, would be laughing. And I'm sure that people throughout the world are looking at the situation right now and looking at Gingrich and looking at Dole and looking at Clinton and laughing at how inane and how asinine and how babyish the leaders of the free world are acting in a situation that's so important and so significant. Now, are we going to default? No, we are not going to default. There are some very, very serious bills coming due in the next week. There's a $25 billion interest payment that must be made, and there's a $40 billion principal payment that must be made on the federal debt. And the 1987, after a similar crisis, just as almost as silly as this one, but not quite as serious, Congress came out there and gave Ronald Reagan, a great president at the time, the ability to keep on paying the federal government's debts while we go on with this silly charade that seemed to be at that time in history a yearly phenomenon. And basically it allows shifting of monies from various funds. Now the first fund that they're going to get at is a fund that the federal workers have a lot in stake at. A lot of people know what the Thrift Savings Plan, or TSP, plan is. The largest of the thrift savings plans, which is the government savings plan that the individual can invest in. They match from the federal government if he's on the new FERS plan. That, by the way, is a wonderful plan. And most of the money, there's about $40 billion in it, but 3/4 of it, or about at least 2/3, are invested in what they call the G Fund. The G Fund is government bonds. Those government bonds are reinvested every single day. All they have to do is replace those with IOUs and not reinvest that money, and boom, $21 billion comes right off the debt ceiling. And Congress, with the bill that they sent, would prevent them from being able to do that. And that's almost going to pay for the interest payment that comes due on Wednesday. Then there's the actual Civil Service Retirement Fund. There's $325 billion in that fund. And again, that fund is made up mostly of government securities of one kind or another. And when those government securities come due, the government reinvests them. If the government doesn't reinvest them, replaces them with IOUs, the total amount of the national debt goes down. So they can more than cover the $67 billion that was offered by the Congress without having to take an action. Apparently, the impasse on the debt ceiling lasts 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. The way the Republicans had set up their bill, on December 12th, the actual debt ceiling would go below what the outstanding debt is. There would be an immediate crisis, and the government would not be able to resolve that by shifting funds from one fund to another. And in that case, they would force an instant default on December 12th. And even Rubin and Clinton are not stupid enough to fall for that one. And why they would even think that they would fall for that is ridiculous. So they sent them a bill that's impossible, but it still doesn't excuse Clinton from getting up there like an adult and saying, look, I will have the leaders of Congress in here, and we will sit down and we will face each other across the table until this thing's resolved. That's the way adults would have handled it. And that's not the way either side has handled this situation. And I'm outraged, and I'm going to be affected by it. And a lot of federal workers are. Now, how is the American people going to be affected by it? Well, if you're traveling to the Grand Canyon or you're traveling to Zion Canyon, you'll be very strongly affected by it because there won't be any park rangers. There's a lot of things, 800,000 people, there's a lot of people performing services for the American people. And those services are simply not going to be carried out. There's going to be no new passports. There's going to be no new processing of food stamps. But all the things that people are really dependent on, the Social Security checks, the mail, the air traffic controllers keeping the planes from falling out of the sky, the Amtrak trains people have already bought tickets for. All of that is going to be going on just like business as usual. And because it's just like business as usual, the average American is going to let this farce go on and is not going to be that personally affected. Who are the pawns stuck between these two giant forces, two giant bunch of babies screaming and crying around? The federal worker. The federal worker is being played for by a pawn. There's almost 3 million federal workers out there, including the military, and there's a very, very large number of potential voters that are being spit on and treated like tiny little pawns in a really silly game. And that's not going to last forever. Right now, federal workers don't have the right to run for partisan office. They aren't really, they've eased up on some of the Hatch Act rules, but they're still not really allowed to participate in party politics to the amount that they should. They're allowed to go to party caucuses, whereas that was a questionable situation under the previous law. But basically, federal workers are kept powerless and are not allowed to really participate in the full activity of free expression. Now, I'm an exception to this because I've just taken it on myself to actually get myself a show and get on public access television and say my piece to whoever might be listening. And I don't know how many people are out there watch this show. It's just started, and probably not that many. But for those of you who are out there, call your congressman, because what's going on is ridiculous. Call the president, because what's going on there is ridiculous and should not be allowed to continue. This could go on for a day. This could be resolved by tomorrow. This could go on for a week. If it goes on for a week, then 800,000 workers are going to get partial paychecks. And if it goes on for 3 weeks, then 800,000 workers are going to have no paycheck the following 2 weeks. Now, Congress may just decide to make up the difference and send all the federal workers on a paid vacation. That's unlikely, considering the abuse and that the Republican Congress has been heaping on the heads of federal workers. I've heard some of the politicians and the conservative opinion makers basically say, "Oh, good for them. Let them get out of there. Nobody will even know what's going on. Nobody will care." Well, if you need a passport, you're going to care. If you are in a foreign country and you need the service of your embassy, you're going to care. There's all kinds of people. If you want to go to a national park, you're going to care. A lot of services are not going to get done, and even these, quote, non-essential federal workers are going to find themselves being pretty essential sooner or later. One of the most important things, my understanding, is that government contractors are not going to get paid for the work that they do. And they're the people that are making all of the weapons that are going to be going out to the field and supporting our military. Very important programs could get delayed. Or maybe these companies, just out of the goodness of their heart, will keep on paying and paying right out of their own pocket while they don't get any disbursements from the federal government. I don't know, but I sure hope that the president of GM and the president of Hughes and the president of McDonnell Douglas and the president of Boeing get on their phones and call their little boy Gingrich and put him across their knee and give him a little slap on the behind, because he deserves it. There's no doubt about it. There's some very, very important players that are going to get hurt, and not the least of which may very well be the markets. Now, we may find out what happens tomorrow, but certainly they've found out that 60% of all federal paper, which means the securities that support our national debt that was bought in the last year, was bought by foreigners, because the American government debt is the safest paper, the safest investment that a person from any other country can make. And now that Japan has been having terrible economic problems and their banks seem to be going under, people throughout the world, Europe, Japan, no matter where, invest in federal paper in order to be assured that no matter what horrible things might happen in their country or in their part of the world, no matter what threats, the American government is the most stable economic environment in the entire world. And that may not be a fact after tomorrow, after the silly charade that's been going on over here. And you know, I personally am completely offended, and I'm doubly offended. I think that right now, any congressman that says a nasty word or that implies that a federal worker is bureaucratic or lazy or any other thing should be forced to have a mirror put in front of his face, because he hasn't done his job. He hasn't gotten out that budget on October 1st, which is what his job is. And the people of the United States, that's what we elected them to do. And there absolutely is no excuse to have this kind of impasse on November 13th. And it doesn't look like they're even going to deliver a completed budget until December or January, or maybe 6 months from now. And that's a Republican House and a Republican Senate. These Republicans control both houses of Congress. They have nobody to argue with but themselves. The Democrats have no influence on this at all. Not that they're saints as far as this is concerned. This is a situation that's just incredible. And I'm glad that I can get on TV and spout about it, because at least I have that outlet. There's 800,000 other federal workers who are in uncertainty, many, many federal workers that are considered essential but don't even know it. Many agencies haven't received their marching orders and don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow. We certainly should be getting our act together better than that. Meanwhile, the Republicans and their magnificent victory from 1994, their magnificent plan, their magnificent contract with America, is becoming less and less popular. Their numbers are dropping like a rock. The elderly, women are becoming disillusioned. The elderly voted majority for Republicans in 1994, and as of a month and a half ago, they were already 57% against the Republicans, and as far as the polls are concerned, a lot of them didn't even know what was in the plan and still opposed it. This is Fed Pride with Red Vern. I've been talking about the budget impasse. We'll see whether I have a job to go to tomorrow, and I'll report the situation to you next week. Thank you very much for having me in your living room. Goodbye.